I'm going to put this up, even though it's not particularly central to the requirements of our course. It is nonetheless, I believe, fascinating. So let's think about why I might want to take you through the famous case, legal case that Cicero brought against Gaius Verres. Well, it does shed some light on Roman taxation, or rather, more specifically, provincial government during the Republic. It exposes, or again gives us an insight into what political corruption looked like in ancient Rome. It also provides us with a look at legal proceedings in the period, and also the dynamic between the wealthy and the poor, or as this PowerPoint would have it, the dynamic. So here is the chronology of the case. It begins, well, as you're going to see, it begins before this. 75 BC, it should be BCE. Cicero is quaestor in Western Sicily. Okay. I'm going to leave that there for you to have a look at in your own time, because I would rather press on with the details. Okay. Cicero had been quaestor in Sicily, and he did it really well. He developed this reputation for probity, for honesty, for doing what was required. He hadn't used the position in order to build wealth for himself. He did it apparently out of a sense of public service and no more than that. And the people of Sicily knew that Cicero had built his name as a lawyer on a defense case several years previously, defending Sextus Roscius in a case which on the surface may have been unwinnable, but he did win it. So when the people of Sicily decided that they wanted to bring a prosecution against their former governor Gaius Verres, it made sense for them to go to somebody they knew, but also somebody who they also knew was a master of the courtroom. So Cicero accepts the case in 70 BCE, and he's 36 that year. But it really starts about a decade before that. So what's this Roscius case? This is a tangent within a tangent. We don't entirely need to know the case of Gaius Verres, and yet here we are. And in order to know that a bit better, we need to know the case of Sextus Roscius Jr. So if this if this seems not entirely relevant, well, stick around. It's going to be interesting. Sextus Roscius Senior was a wealthy landowner in Umbria, which is northeast of Rome. And he was visiting Rome when he was murdered. He was murdered in the street. And his son, Sextus Roscius Jr., was not in Rome at the time. However, two relatives, Roscius Magnus and Roscius Capito, had been in a property dispute with Sextus Roscius Senior, and immediately after the murder, Roscius Magnus sent a message to Roscius Capito, who then contacted a guy called Chrysogonus, who was a powerful freedman of the dictator Sulla. Okay, I've color-coded the names to separate them to give you a sense of who these different people are. Roscius is the family name. So Sextus Magnus Capito. I could have done it that way. So the scene is set. There's a land dispute. Roscius Magnus and Roscius Capito want the land of Sextus Roscius Senior. And then he gets murdered. After they contacted Chrysogonus, who was part of the entourage, I guess you would say, of Sulla, the dictator, the most powerful man in Rome at the time, he has Roscius Jr.'s name added to a list of proscriptions, people who it was legal to kill. He added this name. There was a deadline for recording the proscription, and Chrysogonus actually adds that name after the deadline. So it's illegal that he adds Roscius Jr.'s name to the list of proscriptions, these people who you could kill. Chrysogonus then immediately auctions off 13 of Roscius Sr.'s estates. And these have a huge cash value, estimated at 6 million sesterces. But because people were so afraid of Chrysogonus because of his proximity to Sulla, because he's a powerful man, nobody bids against him. So Chrysogonus buys up these massive tracts of land for 2,000 sesterces. Chrysogonus appointed Roscius Magnus, his agent, the guy to look after these estates that he now owns. And Roscius Magnus immediately evicts Sextus Roscius Jr. from his father's land. That whole process, from murder to Sextus Roscius Jr. being evicted, took 9 days. So, Roscius Jr. fears for his life. He runs away to Rome. And at this point, Chrysogonus, Roscius Magnus, and Roscius Capito bring a charge of murder, patricide, against Roscius Jr. They hired a well-known lawyer and bribed several witnesses to testify against Roscius Jr. Roscius Magnus, who's now in control of all of Roscius Sr.'s land, refused to allow the evidence of 2 slaves into court, and these slaves had seen the murder take place. Nobody wanted to represent Roscius Jr. because they feared A, the power of Chrysogonus, but they also feared that the case itself was so strong because, certain evidence was not being allowed into court, and because they'd employed this brilliant lawyer to prosecute. So Roscius Jr. turns to Cicero, who is only 26 years old and has never fought a public trial in his life. It's worth remembering that the Roman punishment for patricide, killing a father. Remember, Roman society is enormously patriarchal. The father is at the center of it, the older man, the senator. Anyway, the person found guilty of patricide was, and it's worth reading this from the slide, stripped, beaten, and sewn into a leather sack containing a dog, a cock, a monkey, and a snake. The sack was then thrown into the river Tiber or the sea. A just appalling way to die, just filled with terror and violence. The prosecution led with a phrase which is commonplace in the law today: qui bono, who benefits. And it's, by and large, it's a reasonable way to look at crime. When you look at a crime, if you look at who benefits from it, you can very often find out who is most likely to have committed the crime. So since Sextus Roscius had the most to gain from murdering his father, he would inherit all of this land. He clearly must be the most likely candidate. However, Cicero argues that Sextus Roscius actually had no motive to kill his father. They got on really well. The father had never planned to disinherit his son, so why on earth would his son need to murder him? Add to that Sextus was not actually in Rome at the time, and he didn't actually have connections. He was known as a good man. He didn't have the connections to go out and, you know, hire a criminal, a murderer, to commit this crime. And also, Cicero argued, patricide is one of the most serious crimes you can commit. Consequently, you should have a really serious amount of evidence if you're going to prove it. And that's logical, that makes sense, surely. But then he did the sensible thing and he posed an alternative. He suggested that the murder was arranged by Roscius Magnus and Roscius Capito. They had plenty of motive for the murder. They had plenty of time to arrange it. They had the connections to arrange it. And their conduct was very suspicious in the aftermath of the murder. They didn't send a message immediately to Sextus Roscius, the son, when the father had been killed. No. They immediately sent a message to Capito. Roscius Magnus sent a message to Capito. Why wouldn't you contact the son first and foremost? And then I'll add to that the notion that Roscius Magnus had refused to allow the testimony of these two slaves who had witnessed the murder. And remember, of course, for slaves' evidence to be accepted, they first had to be tortured. So these slaves had put themselves in a position where they were going to be tortured in order to get this message across. So they really must have believed in what they were saying. Finally, Cicero does something very dangerous. Chrysogonus is politically very high up, very closely connected to the dictator Sulla. So throughout the trial, he goes to great lengths to praise Sulla, to make sure he's on side with Sulla, even though he is charging or making accusations against a man very close to Sulla. He said that Chrysogonus might not have been directly involved in the murder, but he was quickly involved with the conspiracy. Chrysogonus, Cicero says, illegally proscribed Sextus Roscius because the deadline for proscriptions had ended and he was added afterwards. And then Chrysogonus, of course, bought these huge estates for buttons. Chrysogonus ordered the prosecution of the younger Sextus Roscius in order to remove any potential competitor for those estates. Cui bono? Who benefits? So, Cicero is successful in this prosecution against the odds. But it's worth remembering, almost immediately he goes to live in Greece. He disappears. He takes the time to learn a new form of oratory, a new way of speaking in public, a new way of conducting legal cases. But I think it's just as likely that he left Rome immediately after the case in order to escape any repercussions from Sulla. If Sulla is angry because Chrysogonus has been involved in this prosecution, Cicero needs to be far away. Cicero. I have to keep reminding myself of that. So, Cicero goes away, travels around, then he does his time in Sicily as the quaestor, and then we come to in Verem, against Verres. What had Verres done? Let's have a look at the charge sheet, boys and girls. Over 3 years as governor, he had ruined the wheat growers and the revenue collectors by exorbitant cash demands or by the illegal cancelling of contracts, financial corruption. He had robbed temples and private houses of their works of art, and disregarded the rights of Roman citizens. Theft, and then we'll come on to that, the rights of Roman citizens, which is arguably the most serious charge of them all. He had also used the Third Slave War, the Third Servile War, to make money. And how you do that is he would pick the slaves of wealthy landowners and he would charge them with plotting to join Spartacus's revolt. he would sentence the slave to death unless the slave owner happened to come up with a certain sum of money. And if the money was paid, the slave would be returned, the charge would be dropped. And he would name non-existent slaves, charging the owner of these slaves with harbouring a rebellious slave. So he goes to a wealthy man and he says, there is a slave in your employment who is joining this rebellion, and if you can't produce this slave for trial, I'm going to put you in prison unless you give me money. Now, of course, the owner couldn't produce the slave because the slave didn't exist. He just invented them. This is a deeply, deeply corrupt, sinisterly corrupt man. But when we get to the trial, the idea of corruption grows. So, the trial is in 70 BCE. Whereas was a close friend of Quintus Metellus, a patrician who was going to be consul the following year, 69 BCE. Quintus Metellus. Quintus's brother Lucius had been praetor the previous year in 71 BCE and was going to be the governor of Sicily, and was the governor of Sicily in 70 BCE. Hence, when Cicero tries to gather evidence for his trial in 70 BCE, there are a number of blockages put in place by Lucius Metellus. Quintus Metellus had another brother called Marcus, and he was going to be in charge of the corruption court the following year. These three men, who were in positions of extraordinary influence regarding this trial, had a sister called Caecilia Metella, and she was married to Gaius Verres. On top of that, Verres employed the best lawyer in Rome, Hortensius. And Hortensius, by coincidence, had won the election to be the consul of Rome alongside Quintus Metellus the following year. The jury was made up entirely of patrician class. How the hell is Cicero going to press this charge? How is he going to make it stick when the whole thing stinks of corruption? Verres has a strategy. The trial is scheduled to start in the summer of 70 BCE, but as the last slide showed, a number of his friends are going to be influential men in influential positions in 69 BCE. So he plans to delay the trial as much as possible. He drags it out. He wants to drag it out until January 69 BC when these positions are filled. Cicero, on the other hand, he wants to get the trial up and running. He needs to get through his material as quickly as possible, because if it reaches 69 BCE, chances of him being successful are reduced almost to nothing, you would imagine. So Hortensius tries to sideline Verres's prosecution by trying to get a prosecution of a former governor of Bithynia to take precedence. Hortensius stands up in court and says, well, before we have this trial, I think we should be trying this other guy, the former governor of Bithynia. It doesn't work. And when that fails, the defense uses procedural delays, trying to slow things down, because in the second half of 70 BCE, there is a round of public holidays that stretch on for weeks and weeks. And there would be insufficient time for Cicero to prosecute after those holidays. So, in the August, Cicero is right against it here. He's so against the clock. He opens the case, but he then changes the format of the trial so that he can call witnesses much sooner. Usually it was the case that the defense and the prosecuting lawyers would make a series of speeches before witnesses were called. But Cicero changes up the format of the trial in order to get his witnesses in so that he can make the prosecution before time runs out. And he opens up with a blistering first speech. The first thing he does is he flatters the jury. He says, "You're all noble men, you are interested in justice," all this kind of grand ideas, but reminding the senators in the jury that their reputation hinges on this idea of them being honest men. He attacks Juarez's attempts to delay the trial as a sign of his guilt. He makes clear to everyone that everyone knows delaying the trial until the new year is to Juarez's advantage. He kind of says it out loud so that the senators in the jury then have to sort of take his side. If they agree with the delay, then they are seen as complicit, taking part in the delay. And of course, if the trial were delayed into the following year, then that would give Hortensius, Juarez, the whole defense team time to bully, intimidate, and coerce witnesses for the defense. The trial wouldn't stand a chance. The prosecution wouldn't stand a chance. Cicero even remarked, Cicero even remarks that after Hortensius and Metellus had been elected as consul for the following year, he overheard somebody saying to Juarez, "Congratulations, you're as good as acquitted." He argued importantly that much as Juarez was on trial, the Senate was on trial. If they acquit Juarez, it would prove that senatorial juries cannot be trusted when a case is brought against the patrician class. The reputation of the Senate was on the line. As mentioned, in normal trials, normally the prosecution and the defense would make a series of speeches before witnesses, but Cicero requested that he brings his witnesses immediately before the speeches are made. Speech 2. And don't panic, we are coming to the end here. There isn't another speech delivered. Cicero lays out the full charge sheet against Juarez. The main charges concern a naval scandal. I mean, there are loads and loads, but this is the one he chooses to focus on. And it was a form of embezzlement. He accepted a bribe from the Sicilian city of Messana, Juarez. Usually a city either had to produce a ship for the Roman navy, or alternatively they would pay cash, presumably so that Rome could fund the building of a ship somewhere else. So Juarez fraudulently discharged the men from fleet service, but he didn't mark them down as discharged, so they continued to be paid. So he was taking all these salaries for all of these sailors who didn't exist. In addition, pirates that were captured around Sicily were sometimes sold under the table by Juarez as slaves. They should have been executed according to Roman law, but this was a chance for Juarez to make extra cash. And to camouflage the fact that he was selling pirates as slaves rather than executing them, he accused Juarez of administratively shuffling around the pirates to cities that had no knowledge of them and substituting others in their place to be executed. Juarez had accused key slaves of wealthy landowners of being in league with rebelling slaves. I've been over this already. He ordered that ships that had valuable cargoes were impounded in Sicily, allegedly belonging to Quintus Sertorius. So this rebel, Quintus Sertorius, ships arrive. Juarez says, this is a ship of the rebel, so we're going to impound it. Passengers and crew on board were then thrown in prison, and the prison were the old rock quarries. Old rock quarries, they would have, I guess, been modern rock quarries at the time. And many of them were executed without a trial as being sympathizers with this rebel Sertorius. One prisoner of Juarez's scheme, Publius Gavius, was a Roman citizen, and he escaped and he protested about what Juarez was doing to Roman citizens. Juarez had him flogged and then executed. But while he was being flogged, and this is the famous, there's so much from the trial that is famous, but this is the thing which I think has really lasted into popular culture. As he was being flogged, he would cry out repeatedly, I am a Roman citizen. This idea that being a Roman citizen should exclude you from this kind of treatment. And Juarez watched a man say he was a Roman citizen. As he was being flogged, he allowed it. Not only that, he allowed him to be crucified. And then Juarez ordered his lictors to beat an elderly man of Panormus, a town on Sicily, to death for criticizing Juarez's rule. The charges were so numerous and so well argued by Cicero that Hortensius, the greatest lawyer in Rome, immediately advised that Juarez should just leave town. The trial was unwinnable. Partly it was because of the weight of the evidence, but also it was because of Cicero's foresight in telling the jury, you are on trial here. If you are not fair, then people will lose all faith in senatorial juries. So they were kind of intellectually obliged, manipulated, to be honest. By the end of 70 BC, Juarez was living in Massilia, modern-day Marseille, where he was for the rest of his life. History often throws up peculiar ironies. Mark Antony actually had Juarez proscribed in 43 BCE, and he was executed. But in the same proscriptions, Cicero was executed as well. Anyway, senators who won legal prosecutions were entitled to the accused position in the Senate, and that gave Cicero a position further up in the Senate. So, we have to be cautious around our views of these trials because most of the information comes from Cicero's accounts of the trial. And we know that Cicero was shamelessly self-promoting, self-mythologizing, very much concerned with promoting himself in a particular light. Nonetheless, both of these trials, Roscius and Juarez, could have ruined Cicero. And he took them both, and he won them both. This phrase, Civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, was a powerful use of the status of Roman citizens. And it was that sense that a Roman citizen is entitled to certain privileges. That is, I would argue, what worked most against Juarez. He had violated a status which should, and in the Roman world was, inviolable. Good luck turning that into notes. It is worth knowing. It is worth being able to recount at least parts of the Juarez trial. If you have any questions, see me in class.